Hello, everyone. I'm Jude Kelly. I founded the WOW Women of the World festivals and now the WOW Foundation movement 10 years ago. And as you can see, I'm a 65-year-old white cisgendered woman who's from Liverpool originally, UK based. And I spent my life working out what equal rights looks like, what gender justice looks like, but also what justice looks like for a world that doesn't yet exist and I've never seen it. But I would love to see it. I would love to see a world where justice at all levels is something that the human race can thrive on. The world is full of potential, unreleased, and part of what WOW does is celebrate the potential of girls and women, non-binary, and says if we were all allowed to have real equal rights, what an incredible contribution we could make to the world and how different the world would be. So we believe in celebrating the great voices, the stories, the hailed stories and the invisible stories, and bringing them all to the surface. We completely believe that an intersectional understanding is what we want to give each other in order to make progress. And all the time, we're trying to learn from each other. And that includes learning from intergenerational understanding. So I introduced myself and my age because I'm about to introduce a group of much, much younger women who are already proclaimed activists. They're already committed to making change happen in the world and have found some practical ways of making that happen. And I know that one of the things that WOW does is we use each other's inspirational stories to create more optimism and more stamina. And that's exactly what I know I'm going to experience now by talking to them. So let me introduce, first of all, this fantastic group of girls, or do you call yourselves young women? So that's one of the things I want to ask you really, like how you would define yourself in terms of the way people talk about you. The first person is Heba Ahmed. She's a 16-year-old human rights and anti-racist activist from Manchester. So I'm in Liverpool, you're in Manchester, just across the border there. And she's known for creating the Manchester March Instagram page for Black Lives Matter following the death of George Floyd. And she was responsible for 15,000 people attending the Black Lives Matter protest at Piccadilly Gardens in Manchester. She organised the event. She was responsible for the largest civil rights march in Manchester's whole history. And that's a pretty amazing achievement. So Heba, my guess is it didn't arrive out of nothing, out of nowhere. My guess is you had some other things that you were doing before that, but we'll come to that in a minute. Then we've got Amika George, a British activist, campaigns against period poverty in the UK. And I mean, my understanding is that you were kind of goaded or triggered into this because you kind of suddenly heard about this idea that British girls, British women were missing school because of the stigma around menstruation and you couldn't afford sanitary products and it's too embarrassing to ask, you know, both poverty and embarrassment around the idea of menstruation. And so at 17, she organised a petition for Westminster, which got 200,000 signatories and founded the #FreePeriods organisation in April 2017. And it was announced in March that secondary schools in England would receive funding to provide sanitary products free of charge. And we think that Amika was one of the key drivers for that change, obviously along with other campaigners. And she's been honoured in the Time Most Influential Teens of 2018 list, the Big Issue Top 100 Changemakers, and Teen Vogue 21 Under 21. And I think you won a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Goalkeepers Campaign Award in 2018. So I guess your mantle shelf is full of little things that you have to polish. And then finally and not least is Hayat Muse, who's a 17-year-old youth activist from Minneapolis in Minnesota. She founded in 2018, co-founded a youth education reform organization called Labo because of her own relationship with education, her own struggle to get good education within the education system. And she saw for herself the inequity that exists there. And this organization is working to make sure that youth in education get proper tuition, if necessary, individual tutoring, personal and academic mentorship, and proper support workshops, not just for pupils, but for parents as well, so that anybody can advance their full potential, regardless of their background. And obviously this is a political lobbying, not just an educational lobbying. And so far, the Labo organization has impacted on 600 plus students and parents and teachers, and it's got 60 mentors. So, you know, bearing in mind that those people watching, some of whom will be young activists like yourself, some of whom will be older people who've themselves got a history of activism, and some of people who might not even have thought that activism was something that they should do. I'm interested to know from each of you, really, whether you as young women kind of grabbing the idea of making change happen and moving forward in it, have you felt supported by other girls of your same age and the same background? I mean, do you feel like you stand out and are completely different? Or do you feel that you're riding a tide of change that young people are generally part of? Perhaps I can ask Heba first.
Yeah, I think especially creating the whole Manchester March campaign, I was like, I met so many young people who were like me in different cities, like organising Black Lives Matter protests. So yeah, I think it is kind of a wave instead of just one person here, one person here. I think all young people, when it comes to making a change, we all kind of come together, especially with the age of social media.
And before we started recording this, or before I asked you whether you all knew each other, and you've never actually all met, but you knew of each other and kind of went, oh, I love what you do, etc., etc. So, Amika, you know, what's the connecting tissue? How do you stay in touch or find out about each other, and how do you get inspired by each other?
I mean, I find myself inspired by so many amazing activists every day, and think you two are both incredible. I think to answer your question about whether I feel like we're sort of noteworthy individual activists, or, you know, as you were reading out, as you were describing us as kind of inspiring individuals who have won awards or that kind of thing, I kind of feel a bit guilty. Kind of, I think the media and public discourse in general, we find it very easy to uphold certain individuals as inspiring change makers who are kind of like one in a million, as in for your protest, Heba, like it was you organising it, but 15,000 people were involved.
They made it happen, yeah.
Exactly, and I feel the same way about my campaign. I think I created free periods and I started the movement, but the movement was never just me. It was the 200,000 people who signed the petition, the hundreds of people who donated for our legal campaign when it became a legal campaign against the government, and the 2,000 teenagers who went to Downing Street on the 20th of December 3 years ago, wearing red, singing and dancing about periods, and shouting at outside Theresa May's bedroom about how much they wanted free tampons. As in, that was the movement. And I think that's kind of why I do sometimes feel a bit guilty about being upheld as a remarkable individual, because for me that feels like a testament to the fact that society has normalized this idea that young people are generally politically disengaged or narcissistic and only use social media for selfies, but actually we use it for activism and change. And this kind of wave of youth activism isn't new, and it's not exciting or inspiring. It's actually out of necessity, because we look at the adults who have the responsibility and the power to really make change. If you look at someone like Greta Thunberg, the only reason she's had to kind of get up there and speak at the UN is because nobody else is. And that's what I find quite scary and disillusioning sometimes, because it's kind of fallen to young people to take action on the issues that we care about, because we're not seeing ourselves represented or heard in the political sphere.
Mm. Hayat, I mean, you co-founded this educational organisation because you experienced obstacles yourself that other adults haven't solved. And so, in a way, you had to take the reins and say, well, if the adults aren't going to start solving it, then I'm the one that will suffer, because it's my education and other young people like myself. Were people kind of in any way, have you ever experienced any hostility to being a campaigner at an early age, when a lot of people feel as if, you know, young people should wait their turn to have a voice.
I think I'm just gonna like backboard off what Amika said. Especially when you're in the youth activism space, you hear so many words like inspirational and thought-provoking and 1 in a million. And I think those were my biggest hurdles when it came to activism. Like, I'm not in a room activating for education equity so I can get a high five. I'm in a room activating so we can actually make change. I think the biggest hurdle was just sort of this patronizing, almost condescending tone that adults seem to take with me that I don't even think they really noticed. I think it's a tone that people take with youth activists a lot. It's a tone that, good job, thank you for doing something and whatnot. But the truth is, we aren't the ones supposed to be doing something. Youth activism wouldn't be a thing if the adults in charge were actually in charge. So yeah, I think my biggest hurdles, because of my age, were just receiving that high five rather than actually achieving change, which is why I'm doing what I do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But when you have had to make it clear that change is needed and it's too slow and it's not been thoughtful, and you've created a framework, which you obviously have done, you all have done that really. I mean, yeah, you've lit a touch paper, many people have joined you, and you've made that possible. But I agree that, you know, we're part of a much bigger movement, all of us. But, you know, just this idea that if adults had done it, we wouldn't need to do it. Are you glad that you are now an activist? I mean, do the three of you feel, well, these are skills that I'm glad I've got, that it's a worldview that I'm glad I've seen? You know, has it enriched your life and your sense of purpose?
I mean, I think definitely. Yeah. I think the way that it feels like the world is going, and everything that 2020 has thrown at us, and particularly young people's response to it in terms of activism, from the Black Lives Matter movement to the government response to coronavirus to everything else in between. I think we've used social media and protesting to highlight those issues, and it's just proven that activism doesn't have to be a kind of full-time job or the only thing that defines your life. It has to be integrated into your life as just like a thing that everyone does, and it doesn't have to be starting a protest or a campaign or a movement. It can just be something small in your community that can be sometimes invisible, or sometimes no one will know about it, or just be making a switch to green energy in your house, or deciding to stop engaging in fast fashion. And I think that's activism, because I think that's making a difference and it's impactful, even in an unrecognizable way.
One of the things I think that is different, you know, when I was 17, 18, I felt incredibly strongly about a lot of things that I wanted to see changed, but I didn't have social media. You know, we didn't know how to kind of congregate. We didn't know how to convene at scale as easily. But I also don't think I had the same sense of a systemic understanding of, you know, what systemic injustice looks like. But my sense is from the three of you that you have a very strong sense of the way the world is shaped politically in terms of injustice. I mean, Heba, if I can ask you, do you have that sense of looking out at the landscape of injustice and kind of understanding why it exists, and therefore what the tools for change might be?
I think as I started the Manchester March, like, I got to learn more about different types of racism and how we can like combat it. I've been speaking with a lot of people, especially older. I know we're all young, but we still do need older people who are well educated to help us, because I mean, we can't do it all by ourselves. So I think learning from people and about systemic racism, I don't think that I can really talk for other people. Of course, I'm not Black, so I haven't faced some kind of like racism that Black people have. So speaking on that, I don't want to go there. Do you get me?
I do get you. I think it's, but I think it's also important that as a white person, one stands up and says, here's the responsibility that society has to tackle racial injustice, particularly since unless white people tackle it, then they're actually complicit in continuing it.
I think,
so, brilliant become
with white allies, helping us, you know, a lot of white, every race was there at the protest. And I think that is one way to kind of combat racism and be an anti-racist nation. Like being accepted from different stands of life, I guess.
You picked up on this idea that, you know, intergenerationally, you need older people who have been there, done that, have had experience. And I said at the beginning, I think that we need, older people need the sense that young people have optimism, determination, and new views. I think that's incredibly important, that people keep shedding skins and learning new things. But I want to ask, you know, who you've learned from. So Hayat, when you created you co-founded the organization, what were the people who were already in the kind of educational activist sphere, older people, who gave you good learnings? Are the things that you've been able to build on top of what people have already done?
I think my biggest inspiration, even outside of activism, has always been my teachers. School is like a huge thing for me, and I've always felt very connected to my teachers. And actually, it was a teacher that invited me to this teacher education activist meeting, which was like the first time I got to attend an education reform meeting. And the teacher, she was a teacher for 20 years. She's been doing this for a long time. She belonged to the convention for a very long time, and she sort of taught me the ropes and guided me along. I think, yes, we do have a more systemic understanding now, but I don't think we have all the understanding in the world. And I think it's difficult as young people to go from the books and from studying and learning to actual action, and how do we take all we've learned into action. And I'm grateful for the adults in my life who have been taking this action, that have guided me on how to do that and have given me all that I need in order to combat this.
So, I mean, just talking about some of the specific campaigns that you're running, Hayat, what was the obstacles that you experienced in education? Can you just talk about that? Because so much of activism does come from personal experience. Sometimes the most daunting and difficult and traumatic personal experiences that you wouldn't wish on anybody are actually the things that trigger people into activism. What was your experience of education in America?
So I came to the US as a refugee at the age of 4. I didn't speak English, my parents didn't speak English. So entering kindergarten, it seemed like I was already behind. And since I attended really underfunded charter schools, it just seemed like I was getting more and more behind every year. And it just seemed like I was putting all this work into my education, but I wasn't receiving the same back. I think the first time that I really noticed this is when I went to a public high school for high school, and I left my charter school setting, and I would be in classes and teachers would say things like, oh, you should have learned this in the 8th grade, or you should already know this, and you've already been taught this. And I was saying, wait a second, but I haven't been taught this, and I don't know this. And I would see my peers attending things like tutoring session and going off to piano practices, and I just realized there was such a difference between all they had and all I had. And it wasn't no fault of my own, but it was a fault of the system that I was essentially brought into when I first started education.
Because you've made a point, which is that education kind of doesn't really begin at school. Like, your educational chances begin long before you start your school at 5 or 4. It's really entirely to do with the circumstances of you and your family systems and the circumstances that they're in. And so we, you know, the idea that we start off equal and then, you know, good luck. I mean, that's not true, is it? That's a kind of false idea. So what have you created in detail now in your education programs?
I think to combat the first issue, especially learning firsthand how having refugee parents that didn't really go through the Western education system affected me and affected my siblings. One thing that Labo does is we do parent workshops where, of course, since we're students, we have people much older than us and education specialists come in and teach these parents that maybe haven't gone through the Western education system or want to learn more about it, more about the system and how to best help their children navigate it. as well as the fact that most people don't have access to tutoring and mentoring services is another thing that Code Labo combats. We offer free of charge tutoring and mentoring services at libraries, so money doesn't have to be an issue when it comes to those things.
Mm-hmm. So this is an organisation which is obviously going to have a long life. It's going to sustain and develop community in a very important way. And my guess is it's obviously going to be a role model for other similar organisations. In fact, you might even spread the organisation to other parts of the States or other parts of the world. I mean, it's got that long journey potential, hasn't it? I'm interested with something like you, Amika, who was running like a campaign, you know, something where you're really trying to say, first of all, menstruation is something that is normal and must be talked about. And in fact, all issues to do with women's health and women's experiences must be, girls and women's. But secondly, you know, it's expensive and ridiculously expensive, actually. In fact, lots and lots of the products that girls and women have are much more expensive than the same products for boys.
Exactly.
You know, women's deodorant costs more than men's deodorant. Go figure. I mean, it's ridiculous. But anyway, that's another topic. Yeah. But now that you've sort of, if you like, achieved a lot on a campaign, are you thinking that you are now going to run more campaigns, or how do you see your own activism panning out?
Yeah, I mean, it's an exciting time. I think we're all thinking about the future, and especially at our age. And I think activism will definitely continue to be a big part of my life, and I hope it will be. In terms of free periods, so we achieved our aim last year when the government announced that it would be providing every school in England, every school and college. Well, they initially said secondary schools, and then we said, hold on, no, it should be primary schools too, because I started my period in primary school and girls are starting their periods at an increasingly young age, and it should be sixth form colleges too. And so from January 2020, every single primary, secondary school and sixth form college in the country can order in as many period products as they need for free to give to their students, which is great. Unfortunately, there are some issues with the scheme in that it's an opt-in scheme, so the schools have to actively order in the products that they need, and sadly the take-up is quite low as of now, October, almost October. It's only at 40%. So over 60% of schools in England have the budget, but just due to, I think, lack of awareness, just haven't ordered the products yet. And we are quite afraid that the government policy will be that if they haven't used their budget by the end of the year, they'll lose it for 2021. So we're now doing a big push from as of now, from October pretty much onwards, to say we need as many schools as possible to not only order products and distribute them in an empowering and inclusive way, but also make a really big deal out of the fact that we have free period products, because it's amazing that all this time, every boy could walk into a toilet and get free toilet paper, soap, water, whatever they need. And period products should be classed as a basic bathroom essential, and they just haven't been. A woman spends over 18,000 pounds in her lifetime on period products. It's just a complete injustice when we don't choose to menstruate, we don't choose to bleed every month, because it's not that fun. So we've tried to kind of really push that message, and also encourage schools to use the idea of products in schools as an opportunity to expand their period education too, because I think the reason that it took almost 3 years to persuade the government to introduce this policy, and the reason that it took a 17-year-old girl also balancing her A-levels in school at the same time, is because of the taboo. Because every time I had a meeting in Parliament with an MP and said it was about periods, they'd all kind of shuffle awkwardly or look at their phones or look at their feet, because weirdly, even though it's a completely normal, natural process that half the world's population go through, we act like it's, a source of shame and embarrassment. And I just don't think that should be the case. So those are have always been the two facets of free periods: the period poverty and the period taboo, that we're really, really working to change conversation and behavior. But in terms of my personal activism, I'm trying to as you guys have obviously proven, I think youth activism really is the future, and it's something essential. Actually, not just youth activism, but activism in general, in a time like now, when it seems like a lot of people have lost hope in traditional politics and systems. activism has to fill that gap, and we're taking issues into our own hands and making change ourselves. And I've actually written a book that's coming out in January next year called Make It Happen, and the premise is no matter who you are, what your age or race or gender is, you should be an activist. And it's a very practical toolkit on how to do that based on my experiences with free periods.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that sounds great. I mean, there's several things. First of all, there are so many issues around women's health, you know, whether it be menopause, whether it be kind of issues around sexual education and health, orgasms, miscarriages. I mean, you know, the inability for society to recognize the fact that all of these things have been with us forever and still don't get talked about. I mean, it is really a horrific, ridiculous situation, but I'm glad it's changing in some cultures now, finally. But the thing about the word activism, so you're allowed to be in politics, it's conventional. You're allowed to be in kind of volunteering in youth organizations or Oxfam or this, that and the other. And activism, of course, is active citizenship, but it's still perceived to be something which is slightly frightening and, you know, slightly edgy. And sometimes, of course, it is. So, Heba, I know that your dad said, like, fight for what you believe in, as I think you said that he's a kind of person who believes in that, and that's great as a figure himself. But do you, and Manchester's actually a place with an incredible history of activism in all kinds of ways. But do you feel that there are people who still feel that young people should like not be activists because it's not as well behaved as they ought to be?
I think definitely. I know after the protest, I got a lot of comments like, silly little girl, like, I don't know what I'm doing, stuff like that. But honestly, it makes me laugh because I know what I'm doing is good and I'm trying to change the world somehow, even though it's just in my hometown. Like, it has made a difference and it has impacted people's lives. And I think the positive messages always make the day better.
That idea of like being on social media and getting messages like "silly little girl," well, that's quite a nasty little put down. But are you all subject to tough social media? I mean, do you have to protect yourself against difficult social media?
I mean, for me, I know I made my social media private because after we released our 2020 inclusion bill and we went to the House for that, there were a lot of protesters saying that a lot of what we push for is to lessen harsh disciplinary procedures on children because we don't think that's effective. We think it's counterproductive. And there was actually a lot of like pushback about that. So I remember just getting Instagram DMs because that's only the really social media that I use about like what I'm doing isn't smart and it isn't education backed, and we should let the people who have been in this business for a long time do what they're doing. And I just remember, and usually stuff like that doesn't get to me, but when I come on social media, it's for a specific purpose, and that purpose isn't to be tear down. So I just remembered after the first couple of messages, I was like, okay, that's it. And I just made my social media private just so I wouldn't have to deal with that negative side that comes with activism.
Yeah. Is that, what about you, Amika, the negative side of social media?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely kind of an inescapable part of activism, sadly, especially when our lives are so online right now. And I feel like in many ways you can't really do activism without integrating social media and the internet as a form of connecting. I definitely found from when I was just 17, kind of a lot of people, the messages were similar to what you said, Heba, like just people saying, you know, you're just a young girl, what do you know? Or especially around periods and the taboo, saying, oh, periods are disgusting, why are you talking about periods on TV when I'm having my dinner? Like, I don't want to hear it. Or people actually making quite awful assumptions about the girls who are missing school for sometimes a week because they couldn't afford pads or tampons, saying, oh, I'm sure they've just kind of they're bunking off school, or their parents have wasted their money on iPhones and smart TVs. And for me, if anything, that kind of drove me further. It gave me like a kind of new energy, because it made me realize just how widespread this level of ignorance was among a huge proportion of the population. They just didn't realize there was this level of abject poverty in the UK, because we still have this idea that the UK is a prosperous economy and we're the 5th largest economy and everyone's fine and there's no such thing as poverty. And that's definitely what those like Twitter trolls believe in, but it's false, and period poverty is definitely evidence of that. So if anything, it just made me fight harder to try and disprove them, and it gave me, I think, a new lease of determination to achieve what we were set out to do, because we had to prove those people wrong. But sometimes it's hard. It is demoralizing to go on your phone and just want to scroll through Instagram and, you know, get messages that you just don't really want to see. And my approach has always been to kind of ignore them rather than try and fight back in a way that's probably not going to be productive.
Well, the purpose of our coming together on this piece of social media is to say, not only do we inspire each other, because I know the three of you have enjoyed meeting each other, and I've enjoyed meeting you too, but it is important for people watching to think, well, A, you're not alone if you're doing things, B, you can join in, and why not? C, don't patronize young people, because young people are the future, and and that's an incredibly important thing, to have this like intergenerational learning. It matters. And also, you know, if adults are not doing a good enough job, then we could just get better as well, couldn't we? So it's on this Day of the Girl, which the UN created a few years ago out of respect for Malala's push for education. We wanted to celebrate girls. And, you know, girls are doing incredible things to change a world in which they were never given equal rights to begin with. And I think we've got to thank girls for the work that they do against obstacles which, you know, shouldn't be there. So thanks everybody for joining. Thanks Heba, thanks Amika, thanks Hayat. And carry on doing your work in this fabulous way, and helping all of us be better at committing ourselves to make the world a better place in the future. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.